Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and fellow citizens, thank you for joining me today. What I am about to share with you is not a passing headline, not just another piece of daily news. This is a turning point in international affairs that will reverberate through Washington, through Latin America, and indeed across the global stage. Venezuela's geopolitical shift is sending shockwaves in DC, and the consequences are far deeper than most policymakers are willing to admit. Now, let me start with a simple but unsettling question. What happens when a country long dismissed as weak, isolated, and dependent suddenly finds itself empowered by new alliances, new resources, and new leverage? The answer, my friends, is that the balance of power shifts and Washington is left scrambling. Venezuela's strategic realignment is not just a regional adjustment, it is a tectonic shift in the global political landscape, one that Washington did not anticipate and is struggling to confront. For years, U.S. policymakers assumed that Venezuela's isolation was permanent, that sanctions and pressure had cornered the country into irrelevance. But history rarely follows the script of those who presume to dominate it. Venezuela, once thought of as weak and on the verge of collapse, is now emerging with a new diplomatic armor, and that armor is forged through alliances with powerful global players like China, Russia, and the BRICS coalition. The implications of this shift cannot be overstated because it is no longer about whether Venezuela can stand alone. It is about how it can stand stronger by aligning with nations that have the capacity to protect it from the very tools the United States has traditionally used to exert control. The world is changing, and Venezuela has read the moment wisely. It has understood that the rise of multipolarity is not a slogan. It is the reality of the 21st century. The United States is no longer the sole power shaping the rules, and Venezuela has leveraged this change to reposition itself as a player whose survival no longer depends on Washington's approval. Ask yourself this: how does a country go from being under crippling sanctions, inflation, and diplomatic isolation to suddenly being courted as a partner in major global energy and political discussions? The answer is alliances. Caracas has opened its doors to Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi, finding in them not just buyers for its oil, but also shields against Western economic warfare. This is the quiet revolution taking place, one that transforms Venezuela from a pariah into a partner in the emerging global order. Consider China's role. Beijing has long sought to deepen its influence in Latin America as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, and Venezuela presents a perfect case study of how China's financial and infrastructural power can provide lifelines to nations under Western sanctions. Billions in investments, new credit lines, and technical assistance have begun to flow where once only blockades and embargoes stood. Russia, too, has stepped in, not merely as a symbolic ally, but as a critical partner providing military, technological, and political backing. In a time when Washington believed it could isolate Venezuela, what actually happened was the creation of a geopolitical bridge linking Latin America to Eurasia. That bridge is not just symbolic, it is strategic, and it undermines the very foundation of U.S. dominance in the hemisphere. Here is where the shockwave in Washington becomes most apparent. U.S. policymakers for decades treated Latin America as their geopolitical backyard, a region where American will was law and resistance was met with punishment. But today, Venezuela is not bowing to the stick nor begging for the carrot. Instead, it is writing its own script with global partners willing to reinforce its sovereignty. That reality challenges the entire playbook of U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. What happens when the tools of coercion no longer work, when sanctions lose their sting, and when diplomatic isolation turns into an opportunity for alternative partnerships. Suddenly, Washington is left with fewer options, forced into a defensive posture rather than dictating terms. The hook in this story, the part that should grab everyone's attention, is that this realignment does not just affect Venezuela. It is a signal to every nation in the global south that the days of dependency on a single superpower are ending. If Venezuela, battered, sanctioned, and vilified, can carve out new alliances and regain leverage, what does that say to other nations under U.S. pressure? It says there is another path, one where sovereignty can be defended through strategic partnerships, one where the monopoly of power is no longer unchallengeable. That message is powerful, and Washington knows it. In practical terms, this means Venezuela now sits at the crossroads of great power competition, a position of weakness turned into strength. Its oil is not just energy, it is leverage. Its alliances are not just friendships, they are insurance policies against future attempts at coercion. And its defiance is not just rhetoric, it is a demonstration that U.S. Dominance in the region is eroding. This is why Venezuela's strategic realignment sends shockwaves through D.C., because it symbolizes more than a policy failure. It represents the end of an era where America assumed that it alone could dictate the course of events in Latin America. The rise of multipolarity, with Venezuela as a pivotal example, changes that calculus forever. Oil has always been more than just a commodity. It has been a weapon of power, a lever of influence, and a decisive factor in shaping international relations. For Venezuela, possessing the world's largest proven oil reserves has long been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it endowed the country with immense potential wealth and geopolitical importance. On the other, it made Venezuela a target for exploitation, intervention, and endless pressure from outside powers, particularly the United States. Yet what is unfolding today is a reversal of roles. Venezuela's oil, once seen as a resource vulnerable to seizure or manipulation, is being transformed into a strategic tool to challenge Washington's dominance and realign global energy politics. Here is the fundamental shift. The global demand for energy is not declining but evolving, and new markets are eager to secure supplies free from Western conditionalities. China and India, both energy-hungry giants, have shown a keen interest in diversifying their oil imports, and Venezuela provides exactly that opportunity. With sanctions cutting it off from traditional Western markets, Caracas has turned eastward, offering its reserves to nations willing to trade on terms outside the dollar-dominated system. This pivot is not just economic, it is political. By rerouting its oil to Asia and strengthening ties with alternative financial institutions, Venezuela is undermining the U.S. grip on global energy flows, a grip that Washington has relied upon for decades to reinforce its global supremacy. Consider the psychological effect this has in D.C. For years, sanctions were imposed with the expectation that Venezuela's oil would be stranded, that its inability to sell in Western markets would crush its economy and eventually topple its leadership. But the reality is starkly different. Tankers still leave Venezuelan ports, deals are struck in yuan, rubles, and even cryptocurrency, and new shipping routes circumvent traditional choke points controlled by Western allies. In other words, what was supposed to be a chokehold has instead pushed Venezuela into the heart of a new global energy map, one that bypasses Washington's control. The hook here is simple yet devastating. Oil, once a symbol of Venezuela's vulnerability, has become its shield. This transformation is amplified by the broader energy context. As Europe scrambles to secure non-Russian energy sources in the wake of geopolitical conflicts, And as the United States tries to maintain leverage over global oil pricing through OPEC+ negotiations, Venezuela's reserves take on renewed importance. The prospect of Caracas cooperating more closely with Russia and Iran, two nations also under heavy U.S. sanctions, creates a potential energy bloc that could shift market dynamics. Imagine a scenario where these nations coordinate production levels, pricing strategies, and export destinations. Suddenly, Washington finds itself reacting rather than dictating, a position it has not been accustomed to in decades. Oil also carries symbolic power, and that symbolism is not lost on either Venezuela or the United States. For Washington, the fear is not only that Venezuela's oil revenues strengthen its government, but that Caracas uses this as resource as leverage to build alliances that resist U.S. hegemony. Each barrel of oil sold outside the U.S. system is a statement that alternatives exist, that the dollar is not indispensable, and that sanctions can be outmaneuvered. Each deal struck with China or India, each cargo delivered despite restrictions, chips away at the myth of American omnipotence. That erosion of perception is as dangerous to U.S. influence as the actual economic loss. What makes this situation more urgent is the growing awareness among other nations. If Venezuela can weaponize its oil to withstand sanctions and reassert sovereignty, what prevents other resource-rich nations from following suit? Countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia are watching closely. They see that the U.S. cannot easily control global oil markets anymore, and they are learning that energy can be wielded as a political equalizer. The very tool Washington once used to discipline others is being turned against it, and Venezuela is at the center of this reversal. The broader public must grasp this reality. Oil is no longer just fueling cars or powering factories. It is fueling the rise of multipolarity. The petrodollar system that underpinned U.S. financial and geopolitical dominance for nearly half a century is being chipped away by countries like Venezuela choosing to transact outside its orbit. This is the deeper shockwave radiating from Caracas. Oil is not just black gold. It is the currency of sovereignty, and in Venezuela's hands, it is becoming a weapon that changes the balance of global power. For decades, sanctions have been Washington's weapon of choice, a tool designed to bend nations into compliance without firing a single shot. The logic seems straightforward: isolate a country financially, cut off its access to global markets, restrict its ability to transact in dollars, and eventually its economy collapses, forcing political change. This strategy has been applied from Havana to Tehran, from Moscow to Caracas. But what happens when the weapon loses its sting? What happens when the very countries meant to be crushed by sanctions adapt, innovate, and build alternative systems that render Washington's tools blunt? This is exactly the story unfolding with Venezuela, and the implications go far beyond Caracas. The case of Venezuela is particularly striking because U.S. policymakers believed it to be one of the clearest examples of sanctions success. A resource-rich country dependent on oil exports, reliant on access to Western financial systems, and plagued by internal political and economic crises. Surely this was a perfect target. When sanctions were tightened, Washington expected economic freefall to translate into regime collapse. The population, deprived of goods and services, was supposed to turn on its government. But here is the hook: instead of capitulation, what we are witnessing is adaptation. Venezuela has not only survived, but is actively finding ways to work around U.S. restrictions, exposing a larger weakness in the sanction strategy itself. One of the most important developments is the rise of alternative financial networks. Sanctions depend heavily on U.S. dominance over the global banking system, particularly the central role of the dollar and institutions like STUPIFT. By blocking Venezuela from these systems, the assumption was that Caracas would be paralyzed, yet the reality is different. Transactions are now increasingly being conducted in yuan, rubles, and other currencies. Bilateral agreements with China, Russia, Turkey, and even regional allies have allowed Venezuela to bypass traditional banking channels. This is not just improvisation. It is part of a larger global trend where countries are actively de-dollarizing, reducing their dependence on the very system that Washington uses as leverage. At the same time, Venezuela has leaned on its oil as both a bargaining chip and a lifeline. Barter deals where oil is exchanged directly for goods and services have become a mechanism to keep trade alive without touching the dollar. Tankers rerouted to Asian markets, shipments conducted quietly, and agreements structured to avoid U.S. surveillance have kept revenues flowing. Each of these steps illustrates a critical point. Sanctions can disrupt, but they no longer guarantee domination. Nations are discovering creative ways to survive outside the U.S.-led system. And Venezuela is a test case of how resilience can blunt Washington's sharpest tool. The weakening of sanctions power is not just about Venezuela's ingenuity, it is about the changing global environment. When sanctions were applied against Cuba decades ago, there were few alternative partners willing to defy Washington. Today, the landscape is entirely different. The rise of China as an economic powerhouse, Russia's willingness to openly resist U.S. policy, and the solidarity emerging within the BRICS bloc all mean that targeted nations are no longer truly isolated. Instead, they are welcomed into new coalitions that provide financing, markets, and even diplomatic cover. For Venezuela, this has meant finding refuge in a new world order that does not revolve around Washington's approval. The more Washington resorts to sanctions, the more it inadvertently accelerates the creation of this alternative system. Each time a country is cut off from dollar-based trade, it is forced to innovate, to look eastward, to seek alliances with others in the same position. This creates a snowball effect. More nations excluded, more nations motivated to build a parallel system, and eventually a critical mass that erodes the dominance of U.S. economic power. In this sense, sanctions are becoming a self-defeating strategy, weakening the very foundation of influence they were designed to protect. From Washington's perspective, the danger lies not only in Venezuela's survival, but in the precedent it sets. If Caracas can withstand years of crushing measures, what message does that send to other countries under U.S. pressure? It signals that sanctions are survivable, that alternatives exist, and that resistance is not only possible, but increasingly effective. This emboldens nations like Iran, Russia, and even smaller states looking to assert independence from U.S. dictates. The weapon that once inspired fear is beginning to inspire resistance. There is also a psychological dimension to this decline. Sanctions were meant to project inevitability, to demonstrate that no nation could stand against Washington's financial might. But once cracks appear in that narrative, once countries begin to function outside the system, the aura of invincibility fades. The hook here is that perception matters as much as reality. If nations believe they can outlast sanctions, they will be more willing to defy Washington openly, leading to a cascading loss of control. Venezuela's persistence is not just an economic issue, it is a symbolic blow to U.S. credibility. The real shockwave in D.C. is the dawning realization that sanctions are no longer a one-size-fits-all solution. They may hurt, but they do not guarantee surrender. They may isolate temporarily, but they also foster new alliances. In trying to punish Venezuela, Washington has inadvertently helped accelerate the rise of alternative systems that diminish its global reach. This is the paradox that defines the moment. The more sanctions are used, the less effective they become, and the more they fuel the very multipolarity Washington fears. For nearly 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine was treated in Washington as a kind of holy writ. Announced in 1823, it declared Latin America off limits to European interference, but in practice, it became the justification for U.S. dominance over its southern neighbors. From military interventions to covert operations, from the toppling of governments to the manipulation of economies, the doctrine was the foundation of a hemisphere defined by asymmetry, the United States as the master and Latin America as the backyard. But today, in the unfolding drama of Venezuela's realignment, we are witnessing something that seemed unthinkable even a generation ago: the erosion, even the collapse of the Monroe Doctrine as a guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy. The hooks in this story are sharp because this is not only about Venezuela, it is about the wider shift in power dynamics that signals the end of an era where Washington's word was law across the Americas. The very notion of Latin America as a backyard is being rejected outright by governments emboldened by new alliances and new economic opportunities. Venezuela is at the forefront, but it is not alone. Countries across the region have grown wary of outside dictates, tired of policies crafted in DC, boardrooms and think tanks with little regard for local realities. The rise of multipolarity, driven by the ascent of China, Russia, and the BRICS coalition, has given Latin American leaders alternatives. They no longer have to accept Washington's terms. When Caracas signs agreements with Beijing, when Brazil strengthens its role within BRICS, when Mexico asserts independence in its trade and diplomatic policies, each of these acts is a strike against the Monroe Doctrine's legacy. Venezuela's defiance is particularly symbolic because it represents a nation once considered among Washington's easiest targets. For decades, U.S. Oil companies profited from Venezuela's resources. When political winds shifted in Caracas and leaders asserted greater sovereignty, Washington responded with isolation, sanctions, and even hints of regime change. Yet here lies the twist. Instead of buckling under pressure, Venezuela leveraged international partnerships to push back. The very country once portrayed as an example of U.S. control is now a symbol of its decline. This role reversal is what makes policymakers in D.C. uneasy, because if Venezuela can escape the gravitational pull of U.S. dominance, others can follow. This collapse of the Monroe Doctrine is not occurring in a vacuum. It is part of a larger generational shift in Latin America itself. A younger generation of leaders and citizens does not see the United States as the inevitable partner or protector. They see China building infrastructure, Russia providing energy and military technology, and regional integration efforts offering a path toward independence. They ask, why must Washington dictate our policies when alternatives are available? This rhetorical question has become the guiding hook for the region's future, a challenge that DC cannot easily answer without acknowledging its own diminishing leverage. What is striking is how much of this shift is happening not through military confrontation, but through economic realignment. The Monroe Doctrine was enforced historically through interventions, the Marines in Nicaragua, coups in child pressure in Central America. Today, the battlefield is trade, investment, and finance. When China becomes the leading trading partner for South America, when Russia provides arms and energy deals, when regional organizations like CLAC and UNASUR call for autonomy, Washington's grip loosens. Venezuela's pivot eastward is a direct assault on the notion that the hemisphere belongs exclusively to U.S. influence. The end of the Monroe Doctrine era also reflects changes within the United States itself. The old rhetoric of America as the indispensable nation rings hollow at home, where inequality, political dysfunction, and economic anxieties dominate daily life. Citizens increasingly question why resources are spent trying to control distant nations while domestic infrastructure crumbles and basic needs go unmet. In this environment, maintaining the Monroe Doctrine becomes not only difficult, but politically unsustainable. The doctrine relied on a confident, outward looking America. Today's reality is one of doubt, division, and decline. Venezuela's defiance forces Americans to confront that contradiction. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this unraveling for Washington is the precedent it sets. Once the Monroe Doctrine is broken in practice, it cannot easily be restored. If Venezuela can resist, if Brazil can diversify, if Mexico can assert independence, then the very idea of a U.S.-led dominated hemisphere becomes obsolete. Washington might continue to invoke the language of influence, but it will sound increasingly like echoes from another age, words stripped of their power by new realities on the ground. The hook here is that history is moving faster than policymakers can adjust, and denial will only deepen the shock when the old order finally crumbles completely. The realignment in Latin America is not just geopolitical, it is psychological. It marks the end of fear, the end of automatic compliance, the end of treating Washington's approval as essential for legitimacy. Venezuela embodies this new confidence. Its shift is not simply an act of defiance, but a declaration that the hemisphere is no longer defined by a single capital. That message reverberates through the corridors of power in D.C., shaking the foundations of 2 centuries of doctrine and leaving behind a question that Washington has not had to ask in generations. If the Monroe Doctrine is dead, what comes next? The domestic consequences of Venezuela's geopolitical shift are far more significant than Washington would like to admit. Foreign policy is never confined to distant capitals. Its repercussions ripple back into the lives of ordinary Americans. For years, U.S. leaders have pursued strategies aimed at isolating and pressuring Venezuela, believing this would reinforce American influence abroad. Yet the irony is that these very choices are now colliding with realities at home, exposing the limits of empire at a moment when the United States is already struggling with deep internal challenges. The hook here is clear. Every sanction, every diplomatic standoff, every failed attempt to control Venezuela reflects not only a loss of influence overseas, but also a growing cost for American citizens. Consider the energy dimension. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Washington's decision to sanction and isolate Caracas was meant to deprive its government of revenue, but the unintended consequence has been volatility in global oil markets, pushing prices higher. Every spike at the gas pump, every increase in heating costs during winter is felt directly by American households. Voters rarely connect those rising bills with U.S. policy toward Venezuela, but the link is undeniable. A foreign policy designed to weaken another country has instead made life more expensive for millions of Americans who are already grappling with inflation and stagnant wages. It is a textbook case of geopolitical hubris colliding with economic reality. Beyond energy, the broader economic effects of failed foreign policy are evident. Sanctions not only isolate Venezuela, but also complicate trade across the region. U.S. companies that once saw Latin America as a stable and profitable market now face barriers and competitors from China and Russia filling the void. This means fewer opportunities for American businesses, fewer jobs tied to exports, and a steady erosion of economic influence. At a time when American workers feel left behind by globalization, when manufacturing towns are struggling to recover, the consequences of chasing dominance abroad at the expense of practical cooperation are becoming harder to justify. The hook that should resonate with any citizen is simple: the cost of empire is being paid by working families, not the elites who craft foreign policy. There is also a political cost within the United States itself. Washington's repeated failures to bend Venezuela to its will feed a sense of disillusionment with government competence. Citizens see endless talk of sanctions, pressure, and regime change, yet they also see Venezuela still standing, still selling oil, still forging new alliances. This disconnect between rhetoric and reality fuels the perception that U.S. leaders are out of touch, incapable of delivering results abroad or at home. In an era where political trust is already at historic lows, these foreign policy miscalculations only deepen public cynicism. People begin to ask if Washington cannot even achieve its stated goals overseas, why should we trust it to solve problems here at home? The domestic divide also widens because foreign policy often becomes a partisan weapon. Some argue that the U.S. should double down on pressure, others that it should pursue dialogue and diplomacy. But in both cases, Venezuela becomes a proxy for deeper battles about America's role in the world. For ordinary Americans, however, the stakes are more immediate. They want stability in energy prices, opportunities in trade, and leaders focused on rebuilding the domestic economy. Yet foreign policy toward Venezuela continues to reflect outdated doctrines rather than these practical needs. The hook is unavoidable. While politicians posture about ideology in Caracas, families in Cleveland, Detroit, or Phoenix are paying the price. The deeper domestic consequence is the mirror Venezuela holds up to the United States. Its defiance highlights the limits of American power, forcing a reckoning with the illusion of control. For decades, Washington projected strength abroad while neglecting the erosion of its foundations at home, infrastructure crumbling, inequality widening, healthcare inaccessible for millions. Venezuela's survival despite U.S. Pressure underscores the futility of pouring resources into foreign dominance when urgent needs remain unmet domestically. The more Washington clings to the illusion of hegemony, the more it risks alienating its own citizens who increasingly demand investment in their futures rather than futile geopolitical games. In this sense, Venezuela's shift is not just a foreign policy issue, it is a domestic alarm bell. It tells Americans that the costs of empire are no longer abstract, that the consequences of failed strategies land squarely in their wallets, their communities, and their trust in government. The shockwaves from Caracas reverberate all the way to Washington, but they echo most loudly in the lives of ordinary people who are asking a simple but devastating question. Why should we pay the price for policies that do not even work? Washington today finds itself at a crossroads, and Venezuela's strategic shift has forced this moment of reckoning. For decades, U.S. foreign policy operated on the assumption that unilateral dominance was the natural order of things, that America could dictate terms and others would comply. Yet what we are seeing in Venezuela is proof that this assumption no longer holds. The United States now faces a defining choice: continue down the path of confrontation, sanctions, and attempted isolation, or recognize the realities of a multipolar world and seek cooperation grounded in mutual respect. The hook here is stark. This is not simply a question about Venezuela. It is a question about America's future role in global politics. If Washington chooses confrontation, the costs are clear. More sanctions will not bring Venezuela to its knees. Instead, they will push Caracas deeper into the arms of China, Russia, and other powers eager to welcome new partners. Each escalation will only accelerate the erosion of U.S. influence, not just in Venezuela, but across Latin America. Already, countries in the region are paying attention. They see that the U.S. approach has failed to deliver results, while alternative alliances are opening doors to investment, trade, and independence from Western dictates. Confrontation risks transforming not just Venezuela, but the entire hemisphere into a zone increasingly outside Washington's orbit. That would be a historic reversal of nearly 2 centuries of policy. And it would happen not because of foreign resistance alone, but because of U.S. refusal to adapt. On the other hand, cooperation offers an entirely different path, engaging Venezuela as a sovereign partner rather than a subordinate enemy could open opportunities for energy collaboration, regional integration, and diplomatic renewal. At a time when the world is shifting toward multipolarity, building constructive relationships is not a concession. It is a survival strategy. The United States could gain more through dialogue than through endless sanctions. Imagine what it would mean if Washington acknowledged Venezuela's right to self-determination, opened channels for pragmatic agreements, and treated the region not as a backyard, but as an equal. The potential benefits would extend beyond Venezuela. It would signal to Latin America and the world that the U.S. is capable of humility, adjustment, and leadership based on respect rather than coercion. This choice is not merely strategic, it is also moral. For years, ordinary Venezuelans have borne the brunt of sanctions, shortages of medicine, rising poverty, restricted access to international systems. While policymakers in Washington spoke of defending democracy, the reality was hardship for millions of people. The longer confrontation continues, the more America's moral credibility erodes, not only abroad, but in the eyes of its own citizens. Cooperation would allow Washington to reframe its foreign policy around shared prosperity and humanitarian principles rather than punitive measures. That shift could restore some of the legitimacy the United States has lost through decades of interventionism. The urgency of this decision is amplified by domestic pressures. Americans are demanding that leaders focus on rebuilding the nation's foundations, fixing infrastructure, addressing inequality, investing in health and education. Pursuing endless confrontations abroad drains resources and attention from these priorities. By clinging to outdated doctrines, Washington risks not only losing influence overseas, but also losing the confidence of its people at home. The hook is undeniable. The path America chooses in Venezuela is not only about foreign policy, it is a reflection of whether the U.S. government can adapt to the needs of its own citizens in a rapidly changing world. The defining choice, then, is between arrogance and adaptation, between the illusion of control and the reality of cooperation. Venezuela's shift has pulled back the curtain on a new era of global politics. Washington can either recognize this change and position itself as a constructive player in a multipolar system, or it can double down on a strategy that has already failed, ensuring its own decline. The moment is historic, and the consequences will reverberate for decades. The question is not whether change is coming, it already has. The question is whether the United States will resist it to its own detriment or embrace it to build a more balanced and sustainable role in the world.